It was a quiet Friday morning in North London when an emergency call broke through. The voice on the other end belonged to a young mother who sounded terrified, saying her baby wasn't breathing. Paramedics were dispatched immediately. They expected panic, maybe confusion, but not what they were about to walk into. When they arrived at the small flat, the first thing that hit them was the smell of waste clung to every corner. Inside, they found a small child lying still in his cot. He was 17 months old, wearing only a nappy, his skin cold and pale. One of the paramedics leaned over the cot, but it was already clear that there was nothing they could do. The mother stood close by, nervously asking if she could take her cigarettes before going with them. The request caught everyone off guard. The paramedics exchanged glances, not because of her words, but because of what surrounded them. When the ambulance pulled away minutes later, carrying the body of that little boy, no one in that street knew his name. But within hours, the name Peter Connelly would echo across the nation. He had been seen by doctors, nurses, and social workers more than 30 times. Every one of them had looked, listened, and then walked away. That morning, Peter Connelly was pronounced not because no one noticed, but because no one acted. And this case would send 3 people to trial, leaving the world to ask one disturbing question. Why do beasts like this still walk the earth? But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Tracy Connelly was born on June 29, 1981, in Leicester, England, to a mother named Mary O'Connor. Tracy's biological father was a traveling salesman who vanished not long after she was born, leaving Mary to raise 2 young children on her own. But Mary's attention rarely belonged to her children. She was restless, unpredictable, and more interested in chasing men and alcohol than raising a family. By the time Tracy was 2, the family had already moved to Islington, North London, following yet another one of Mary's boyfriends. Tracy grew up craving affection and attention, and by the time she reached her teenage years, that hunger had turned into rebellion. She fought with her mother constantly, stayed away from home for days, and by 13, she was already in contact with social services. The reports from that period described her as a troubled child with low self-esteem, one who had been exposed to and from an early age. She told social workers she was often beaten and shouted at, and eventually she was given a choice: go into a care home or attend a reform school. She entered a local home run by Islington Council, hoping for safety. At 16, she met a man much older than her, a 33-year-old railway worker from Ireland, whose name has never been publicly released. He was kind at first, stable and patient, and for the first time in her life, Tracy believed she had found someone who could fill the void. Their relationship developed quickly, and within weeks, she was pregnant. The 2 married quietly at the Haringey Civic Center. The marriage produced 4 children, and she often said she wanted to create the family she never had. But it didn't take long for the old patterns to return. Each time she gave birth, she fell into deep depression, and each time her husband grew more distant. Social workers began visiting the home regularly, concerned about her mental health and the conditions her children were living in. By 2005, Tracy was 24 and pregnant again. This time, she told her friends she felt different. She said she was finally having a boy and that maybe this child would be her turning point. She went to every scan, attended her checkups, and spoke with excitement about the future. Her husband remained supportive, though their marriage was crumbling beneath years of exhaustion, financial pressure, and Tracy's growing addiction to online chat rooms. She spent hours flirting with strangers. Despite everything, on March 1st, 2006, Tracy gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Peter Connelly. Those who saw them together during those early months remembered how she doted on him. She called him "my smiley boy," and often posted pictures of him with captions that painted the image of a happy home. For a brief moment, she seemed settled, but behind the photos and cheerful words, cracks were already forming again. Her husband was tired of the mess, the arguments, and the emotional chaos that seemed to follow them everywhere, and within 3 months of Peter's birth, he packed his bags and left. And so, Peter's life began in the shadow of instability, in a home that was already breaking apart. And into that emptiness, another man walked in, a man whose presence would change everything. His name is Stephen Barker, a 32-year-old repair worker she met while he was doing maintenance at a friend's flat. He is tall, broad-shouldered, and seemed confident in a way that caught her attention immediately. At first, he came across as gentle and helpful, the kind of man who offered to fix things without being asked. But underneath that calm surface was a history few people knew. Stephen had grown up in Tottenham, not far from Tracy's neighborhood, and his childhood had been as fractured as hers. He had been sent to a special school after being assessed with a low IQ of around 60, and teachers described him as withdrawn and easily angered. He spent most of his teenage years on the edges of trouble, fighting, stealing, and taking out his frustrations on animals. Neighbors later told investigators that he often kept small pets and hurt them for amusement. As an adult, that fascination grew worse. He collected knives, martial arts weapons, and kept a crossbow beside his bed. Friends said he would show off his collection with pride, calling it his protection. But Stephen wasn't alone in his cruelty. His older brother, Jason Owen, was already known to police for violence and intimidation. The two brothers shared a disturbing bond, one built on control and fear. Jason was manipulative, and Stephen often followed his lead. Together, they had once lived with their elderly grandmother, locking her inside cupboards and frightening her for money. When she died before her case went to trial, both men walked free. It was the kind of history that should have raised alarms, but at that time, no one was paying attention. Tracy, meanwhile, was lonely. She had 4 children, a failing marriage behind her, and a fragile sense of worth that had always depended on whoever was willing to stay. And within weeks, he was spending nights at her flat. By the end of 2006, Stephen Barker had effectively moved in, though officially he wasn't supposed to be there. Tracy continued to claim benefits as a single mother, and social services had no idea that another adult man was now living in the home. What had once been a cramped but functional flat in Tottenham now became something else entirely. Tracy, her 4 children, and several large dogs all shared the space with Stephen, who quickly began asserting control. He rarely worked and spent most of his days watching television or lying on the sofa while Tracy ran around after the children. The neighbors complained about the smell and the noise, but inside, the situation was far worse than anyone realized. Peter, who was not yet a year old, began reacting differently whenever Stephen was around. He would cry suddenly, turning away or trying to crawl toward his grandmother when she visited. It was the kind of observation any mother should have stopped and thought about. But Tracy didn't. She brushed it aside, laughing nervously and saying, "He's just scared because Stephen's tall." It wasn't true, and deep down, she may have known it. But after years of rejection and loneliness, she wasn't willing to lose another man. And then came the first doctor's visit, and the first missed chance. By September 2006, Peter was only 6 months old, but Tracy had already started bringing him to the doctor more often than most mothers would. She told the GP that her baby bruised easily, an explanation that sounded casual, even ordinary at first. The doctor examined the child briefly, saw faint marks on his face and chest, and wrote a short note in his file, but there was no referral and no follow-up. But the truth was that nothing about Peter's situation was ordinary. The marks weren't fading, and the explanations kept changing. A month later, in October, Tracy brought him back, this time saying he had fallen down the stairs. It should have raised an immediate alarm. Peter was only 8 months old, barely able to crawl, certainly not old enough to walk or climb. But again, the GP accepted her story. He described Peter as accident-prone and sent them home. No one asked what kind of house allowed an infant to tumble down a staircase, or who had been watching him at the time. By December, the visits had become more frequent and the injuries harder to dismiss. On December 11th, Tracy took Peter to the same GP again, saying that he'd fallen off the couch and been scratched by the family dog. This time, his face was swollen, his chest mottled with dark bruises, and there was a lump forming on his forehead. The doctor hesitated. Something about it didn't fit. He decided to refer the baby to Whittington Hospital for a full examination. At the hospital, pediatrician Dr. Heather McKinnon examined Peter carefully and documented multiple bruises of different ages across his body, on his face, his chest, and his buttocks. The swelling on his forehead was concerning enough to suggest a serious fall or impact. She wrote detailed notes and made her recommendation clear: not to be allowed home, police protection order if necessary. It was one of the first clear warnings that something was wrong. So, the hospital called social services and the police were brought in. Officers interviewed both Tracy and her mother, Mary O'Connor, who had also been helping to care for Peter. They denied everything. For a brief moment, it seemed as though someone had finally seen through the excuses. Dr. McKinnon's notes were strong enough to justify keeping Peter in protective custody, but somewhere between the hospital, social services, and the police station, the urgency faded. By December 15th, just 4 days after her report, Peter was discharged, not back to his mother, but to a family friend named who agreed to look after him temporarily, and she was caring and responsible. Then, on December 19th, police arrested both Tracy and her mother on suspicion of child. It seemed like the turning point. The investigation was brief though, and after a few hours of questioning, both women were released on bail. The police cited a lack of clear evidence to charge either of them. It was another warning that ended in silence. 3 days later, on December 22nd, social services finally placed Peter on the Child Protection Register, marking him officially as a child at risk of significant harm. Under UK law, that classification meant his case had reached the legal threshold for intervention. The state could have sought a care order and taken him into full protective custody. But they didn't. The social work team decided that support and monitoring would be enough. For the next month, Peter stayed with the family friend, and he was safe, clean, and content. The bruises healed, the swelling faded, and for the first time in his short life, he began to look like a healthy baby again. The family friend later said he was always hungry but full of smiles, eager to play, and quick to bond. She noticed how much calmer he seemed away from his mother's flat. But bureaucracy moves slowly and empathy fades fast. By January 26, 2007, just 5 weeks after being placed in care, the local authority decided it was time to return Peter to his mother. The reports described Tracy as cooperative and improving, and the caseworkers believed she understood what was expected of her. They warned her about proper supervision, advised her to keep the dogs away from Peter, and arranged for regular visits. That day, social workers watched as Peter was handed back to his mother. He clung to the shoulder of the family friend and began to cry. He had been safe for barely 5 weeks, and then back into the same house. By February 2007, the responsibility for Peter's case had passed to a new social worker, Maria Ward. She visited the family's flat on Hermitage Road in Tottenham for the first time, stepping into an environment that immediately felt wrong. Maria noted that there were at least 3 dogs roaming freely around the rooms, including a Rottweiler that often brushed past the baby's cot. She wrote in her notes that the home was chaotic and unhygienic, but concluded that Tracy seemed cooperative and in need of support rather than punishment. Tracy smiled through the visit, promised to tidy up, and assured Maria that she loved her children. She even laughed when Maria suggested she remove the dogs, saying they were part of the family. But behind that cheerful tone, the cycle had already begun again. In March, a school nurse at the local primary school noticed Tracy outside the gates, shouting at one of her older children. The argument escalated, and the nurse saw her slap the child across the face. Only a few weeks later, things worsened. In April 2007, Peter was rushed to North Middlesex Hospital with swelling on the left side of his head. His scalp was scratched, his hair was matted with dirt, and nurses later discovered lice crawling across his scalp. Tracy told the doctors that another child at home had pushed him into a marble fireplace. The explanation sounded implausible, but it was written down anyway. Doctors treated the swelling and noted multiple bruises on his face, back, and legs. Instead of raising an emergency alert, the hospital issued advice. They told Tracy to use a fire guard and be more careful. Peter was discharged that same day, back into the same environment, with only a fire guard standing between him and the next injury. By June, the situation had grown dire. Maria Ward decided to make an unannounced visit after noticing inconsistent updates from Tracy. When she arrived at the flat, she found Peter lying on the sofa. He looked pale, his face expressionless, and his body limp. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and faint marks were visible on his neck and arms. Tracy claimed he had been playing roughly with another child and that he tired himself out, but Maria's instincts told her something was off. She arranged for him to be taken to the hospital for examination. At the hospital, doctors recorded 12 visible marks across his face and body. Tracy gave another round of explanations. He had fallen, he had banged into furniture, The dogs had scratched him, and once again the professionals accepted her words. That same week, tensions began to rise between agencies. The police wanted stronger evidence before making another arrest, while social services insisted they needed police cooperation to intervene. The two sides argued over responsibility until both simply stepped back, convinced it was the other's duty to act. And as the arguments continued, the situation inside the flat grew even worse. In the same month, Jason Owen, Stephen Barker's older brother, moved into the home with his 15-year-old girlfriend and her 3 children while trying to avoid police attention. And Tracy, who was used to chaos, agreed to let them stay for a few days, which turned into months. The overcrowded home now held 11 people, 4 of Tracy's own children, Jason and his girlfriend, her 3 children, Stephen, and Tracy herself. The dogs were still there too. Every room was crammed with mattresses, dirty clothes, and stale air. Peter's cot was squeezed into a corner beside the television. When later questioned, local authorities claimed they didn't know that Jason and his girlfriend had moved in. Even when the neighbors complained about the smell, the system still believed he was safe. By July 2007, the warning signs were no longer subtle. Peter's childminder, Ann Walker, had been sounding the alarm for weeks. She had looked after him before, back when he was staying safely with family friends, and she immediately noticed how much he had changed since returning to his mother's care. Ann called social services repeatedly, leaving messages for anyone who would listen. He was dying, she later said, and I told them, but no one came. Each time, her calls were logged as concern raised, then quietly filed away. Peter's deterioration was visible even to the untrained eye. His weight had dropped drastically, falling from the 25th percentile to the 9th percentile by early August. He had fresh bruises almost every week, and there were scratches across his scalp that never seemed to heal. Ann remembered how his fingernails were broken and black with dirt, and that he smelled constantly of vomit. He just wanted to be held, she recalled, and every time you lifted him, he whimpered. Despite these reports, case files continued to frame the situation as manageable. Social services held an internal legal meeting on July 25th, with Maria Ward and her team reviewing the case. The question was whether Peter's situation met the legal threshold for immediate removal under child protection law. After reviewing the medical notes and past interventions, the committee concluded that the threshold was not met. They argued that the evidence did not prove deliberate harm, only neglect. And so, once again, Peter stayed where he was. 5 days later, on July 30th, Maria Ward made what would be her last recorded home visit. When she arrived, Tracy greeted her with a smile and told her that Peter had just had a snack. His face was smeared with chocolate, thick around his mouth and cheeks. It looked odd, but Tracy's explanation came quickly. She noted that Peter appeared grubby but playful, unaware that the chocolate was concealing dark bruises underneath his skin. Maria asked Tracy to clean him up and bring him back to the living room for a quick health check. Tracy agreed, but never returned. After several minutes, Maria finished her paperwork and left. That entry would later stand as one of the last official records of Peter alive. The next day, July 31st, they formally closed the earlier neglect case against Tracy and her mother. The conclusion stated that there was insufficient evidence to pursue charges. The file was marked finalized and stored away. The 1st of August 2007 began like any other uneasy morning in the Connelly flat. Tracy said Peter had been cranky all night, restless and irritable. By then, he was thin and pale, with hollow eyes that looked older than his 17 months. She decided to take him to St. Anne's Hospital in Haringey, claiming he had a cold and a mild infection. The hospital that day was running short-staffed. Peter's regular pediatrician was unavailable, so the case fell to a locum doctor, Dr. Sabah Al-Zayat, a temporary stand-in covering the clinic. She saw dozens of children daily and had only a few minutes for each one. When Peter was brought in, she noted immediately that he looked small for his age, underweight, tired, and visibly uncomfortable. He whimpered when placed on the examination table and cried when she tried to check his ears. Dr. Al-Zayat's notes later described him as cranky and feverish, but what she didn't note were the other signs: the bruising beneath the chocolate smears, the stiffness in his limbs, and the way his back arched when he was lifted. She considered performing a full physical exam, but hesitated. She later said she feared that doing so might upset the child further. So, after a brief visual check, she concluded that Peter had a minor infection and sent him home with advice for rest and fluids. It was a decision that would later haunt her, the final chance for someone to intervene, missed by a matter of minutes. That same evening, while Peter was lying weak and drowsy at home, a letter arrived from the Crown Prosecution Service. The notice informed Tracy that the earlier neglect charges against her had officially been dropped. To her, it felt like vindication. She told neighbors and family that the case was over, that she had been proved right all along. Later that night, she called a friend and cried with relief. "I'm going to hug him and bake him a cake," she said. She promised that things would be different, that she would be a better mother, that she would put everything behind her. But by the next morning, there would be no cake. By the morning of August 3rd, 2007, Tracy Connelly said she went to check on Peter sometime before noon, expecting to find him asleep. Instead, she found him still and motionless in the cot. Immediately, panic set in, and she picked up her phone and dialed for help. At 11:35 a.m., the London Ambulance Service received a distress call from a young mother claiming that her baby wasn't breathing. Her voice trembled as she gave the address on Hermitage Road. The dispatcher instructed her to begin resuscitation, but she said she didn't know how. When paramedics arrived, the front door was open, and Tracy was standing inside, shaking and disoriented. They rushed past her into the bedroom and found Peter lying in his cot, wearing only a nappy. His body was cool to the touch, and rigor mortis had already begun. The paramedics started CPR, but one of them noted quietly that it was likely too late. The home itself told its own story. The smell hit them first, a stench of decay, filth, and animal waste. One of the paramedics later recalled seeing human waste on the walls near the cot. When the crew told her they needed to take Peter to the hospital, she nodded, but then hesitated. "Can I grab my cigarettes first?" she asked quietly. The words hung in the air, shocking in their detachment. One of the paramedics told her there was no time, and they carried the boy out. At 12:19 p.m. at North Middlesex Hospital, Peter Connelly was officially pronounced dead. The medical staff tried to resuscitate him one final time, but his body was too far gone. By mid-afternoon, detectives had arrived at the hospital. They began their inquiry with the grim certainty that this was not a natural death. Tracy was taken into custody that same day, questioned under suspicion of neglect and possible homicide. Meanwhile, Stephen Barker and Jason Owen had already vanished. Neighbors said they saw them leave the flat in a hurry, carrying bags and bedding. It was later discovered that those bags contained Peter's sheets and clothes. For 11 days, they evaded capture. Then police traced them to a campsite in Epping Forest, where they were found living in a tent surrounded by knives, crossbows, and other weapons. Both men were arrested without resistance. Back in North London, investigators began piecing together the story. They went through months of reports, hospital records, and social service files. The investigation uncovered what doctors had missed and what others had ignored. The following day, August 4th, 2007, a post-mortem examination was ordered at Great Ormond Street Hospital, one of the most advanced pediatric facilities in London. The results were devastating. Peter's small body revealed months of suffering that no one had managed to stop. The coroner documented multiple fractures of the ribs and damage to his spine that had caused internal bleeding. As investigators combed through Peter's medical and social service records, they uncovered a staggering pattern of conflicting reports and missed opportunities. Detective Stuart O'Brien, one of the lead investigators, later told the court that when he first reviewed Peter's file, he couldn't believe how many people had been involved. There were more than 60 separate contacts with health or welfare professionals in just over a year, and yet not one of them had saved him. When O'Brien testified, he said quietly, "Either he's the unluckiest child in the world or it's something more." And it had always been something more. When the details emerged, the public reaction was explosive. Newspapers filled their front pages with the story of Baby P, a name used to protect his identity during the trial. Politicians demanded answers, and the nation's outrage turned toward the system that had failed him. Behind the media storm, one image remained fixed in the minds of everyone who read the reports: a smiling child with blonde curls and blue eyes, who had once been called Smiley by his family. The image of innocence met with unthinkable failure. And for the first time, the full horror of what had been missed was clear. Every report, every home visit, every excuse, they were all pieces of a puzzle that no one had put together until it was too late. By late 2008, more than a year after Peter's death, the courtroom at the Old Bailey was filled with journalists, lawyers, and a public desperate for justice. The public reaction was explosive. Newspapers filled their front pages with the story of Baby P, a name used to protect his identity during the trial. Politicians demanded answers, and the nation's outrage turned toward the system that had failed him. Behind the media storm, one image remained fixed in the minds of everyone who read the reports: a smiling child with blonde curls and blue eyes, who had once been called Smiley by his family. The image of innocence met with unthinkable failure. And for the first time, the full horror of what had been missed was clear. Every report, every home visit, every excuse, they were all pieces of a puzzle that no one had put together until it was too late. By late 2008, more than a year after Peter's death, the courtroom at the Old Bailey was filled with journalists, lawyers, and a public desperate for justice. The case that had shocked Britain was finally being heard. Each defendant sat behind bulletproof glass: Tracy Connelly, the boy's mother; Stephen Barker, her boyfriend; and Jason Owen, Barker's brother. The charge was clear: causing or allowing the death of a child or vulnerable person. In November 2008, Tracy stood before the judge and pleaded guilty. She admitted that she had failed to protect her son, even though she knew he was being harmed. Her lawyers argued that she was manipulated and terrified of Barker, that she had been emotionally broken and dependent on him. But the prosecution countered that her neglect had gone far beyond fear. It was indifference. Barker and Owen refused to admit guilt. Their trial ran for weeks, with prosecutors presenting hospital files, police notes, and witness testimonies that painted a grim picture of what had unfolded in that Tottenham home. The jury listened to evidence of injuries that could not be explained away and read the social service records that had documented every warning sign. In the end, the jury found both men guilty of the same charge: causing or allowing Peter's death. However, murder was not proven, as there was no single act identified as the cause of death. The verdict brought a wave of anger across the country. For many, it felt like the justice system had fallen short again. Then, in April 2009, a second trial was held. This time, it was for an unrelated case involving the assault of another child, a 2-year-old girl who had also been under child protection. Barker was convicted of assaulting the child, while Tracy was cleared of cruelty charges. The findings added another layer to the horror, confirming that Peter's death had not been an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of violence and neglect. Tracy Connelly received an indefinite sentence, with a minimum term of 5 years before she could apply for parole. Stephen Barker was handed a life sentence, with a minimum of 10 years plus an additional 12 years for the separate assault charge, both to run concurrently. Jason Owen was also given an indefinite term with a minimum of 3 years, which was later changed on appeal to a fixed 6-year sentence. The sentences were legal, but they did not feel equal to the loss. Reporters outside the courthouse said the crowd's reaction was a mix of relief and disbelief. Relief that someone had finally been held responsible, and disbelief that the penalties felt so light for the suffering of one small child. And yet, for the first time since that August morning, there was at least an acknowledgement that Peter's death had not been an accident nor a mystery, but a crime. Ed Balls, the Secretary of State for Children, Schools, and Families, ordered an immediate inquiry into what had gone wrong in Haringey. The results were damning. Within days, several senior officials at Haringey Council were dismissed, including the head of Children's Services, Sharon Shoesmith. The council defended itself, claiming staff were overstretched, but that explanation only fueled public outrage. Then came Lord Laming's review, an independent national investigation into child protection across England. His report did not just focus on Haringey. It exposed a nationwide pattern of missed warnings, fragmented communication, and chronic underfunding. He described the system as one where information is gathered but not acted upon, and where professional caution replaces professional courage. Hospitals issued statements expressing regret for failing to escalate Peter's case. The police apologized for not enforcing protection orders. And Haringey Social Services released a formal statement acknowledging their collective failure. But for many, those apologies felt hollow. Inside those agencies, there were also people who had tried to raise the alarm: social workers, nurses, and support staff who had seen the danger but were either ignored or silenced. Some later said they were discouraged from escalating concerns because it would reflect badly on their departments. The case became a symbol of how bureaucratic fear could outweigh a child's life. In the months that followed, Peter's face became a call for reform, yet the deeper truth was already clear. The system itself had been on trial, and it had failed. In the years that followed, each person connected to Peter's death took a different path through the justice system, but the shadow of the case never faded. Jason Owen, Barker's brother, was the first to be released. In 2011, after serving just 6 years of his revised sentence, he was freed under a new identity. 2 years later, in 2013, he was recalled to prison for breaching parole conditions. Reports later claimed he had been working as a personal trainer under an alias, blending quietly back into society. Tracy Connelly was released in 2013 after serving her minimum term, but was recalled in 2015 for breaching parole after allegedly selling indecent photos online. Her next few years were spent in and out of review hearings, denied parole in 2017 and 2019, with officials citing lack of insight into her crimes. In 2022, she was released again under strict supervision, including a curfew and an electronic tag. But by 2024, she was recalled once more after breaching her conditions. Each time her name appeared in the news, the outrage reignited. Stephen Barker has remained in prison, serving his concurrent life and assault sentences. Reports suggest he has shown little remorse, and his parole applications have consistently been denied. Meanwhile, Peter's biological father, whose name was withheld for privacy, devoted his life to the children he had left, Peter's 3 sisters. He left his job to raise them full-time, saying he wanted to give them back what they'd lost. The girls have since grown up under counseling and care, away from the headlines that defined their early years. In the wake of Peter's death, national reforms were promised: more training, stricter oversight, and faster response systems for at-risk children. For a time, it seemed like change might come. But years later, surveys of social workers revealed a haunting pattern. Many still feared being blamed for another Baby P case. Instead of acting decisively, they hesitated, afraid of losing their jobs, their licenses, or their reputations. And now, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think could have changed the outcome of this case? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one of them because every perspective matters. If this story moved you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next one.